now do I truly understand the terrible desperation of those who died in their millions in Stalin's jails. Not physical suffering. That can be endured. But people were deprived of the smallest hope. They were convinced that the dictatorship was all-powerful. That is unbearable.
Pyotr Grigorovich Grigorenko, age 63, 34 years in the Soviet Army, retired Major General, Order of the Red Star, Order of the Red Flag, Order of Lenin, a committed communist and a member of the Communist Party since 1927. For the last 10 years, one of the most outspoken critics of the Soviet government inside Russia. In February this year, declared insane, sentenced to detention in a mental prison without term.
In his absence, this court finds P.G. Grigorenko, under Article 70 and 190, Section 1 of the Criminal Code, guilty of slanderous statements and agitation against the Soviet state. As these crimes were committed whilst the prisoner was of unsound mind, Grigorenko is exempt from criminal punishment. He is to be placed for compulsory treatment at the prison psychiatric clinic in Kazan.
Grigorenko has managed to smuggle out from prison to his wife a detailed diary of his experiences since his arrest in May last year. It has now reached the West through an underground route of established reliability. The story told in Grigorenko's prison diary cannot be checked in detail. We asked the Russians to comment. They declined. So we can only look at what happened to Grigorenko with his eyes. But he is a precise man, a stickler for detail, and he obviously measures words before he uses them. The diary reveals that, despite everything, he remains an unshakable communist, believing passionately in the ideals of the Soviet Constitution. His attack is on those men he accuses of flouting the Constitution and of abusing their power to stifle dissent, the present regime. All the incidents and conversations which follow are exact transcriptions of Grigorenko's own words. Nothing has been invented. This program reconstructs, with actors, what happened to one man who wouldn't keep quiet.
A large room scattered with office desks, one of them in the center. 4 people sit at this desk. Morozov, the director of the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry and a member of the Soviet Academy of Medicine. Luntz, head of the special department of the Serbsky Institute and director of diagnoses connected with political cases. Maya Mikhailovna, the doctor in charge of my case. And a man in a brown suit, the only person in the room not wearing a white coat. It's obvious that these 4 are the members of the commission. The rest are just observers. They are here to learn.
Sit down.
I sit down, look around.
November 19th, 1969. The Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry, Moscow. This is the commission which is to investigate Grigorenko's sanity. For the past 6 months, he's been in prison without trial, accused of slandering the Soviet state. He's repeatedly protested. He's been beaten and forcibly fed during a hunger strike. He's been refused any meeting with a lawyer, his wife, or friends. He's not been allowed to send or receive a single letter.
A trial is publicity. Therefore, they wouldn't put me on trial. There remained one other way, to declare me insane, once again.
There are some familiar faces here, I suppose.
I'd been brought to the Serbsky Institute once before, in 1964. At that time, I hadn't even heard that the practice of silencing dissent by declaring sane people mad was still going on. But I was certified then and locked away for 14 months. That time, I did eventually get out. This time, I knew they would take no chance.
Well, how do you feel?
I hardly know how to reply. Perhaps rather like an experimental rabbit, if you could realize what was going on.
No, I don't mean that. I'd like to know if there's any difference between how you feel now and how you felt when you were examined by us in 1964.
There is.
In what way?
You see, at that time, this idea of using an investigation to make the defendant into a madman was totally unexpected. I was literally shocked when I realized what was happening. So I regarded the staff of the Institute as a specially selected group of hardened criminals. I was convinced I'd been brought here simply to rubber stamp my committal to a lunatic asylum for the rest of my life. I was so shocked by what I found out here in 1964 that even today, what happened to me then seems like a terrible nightmare.
Grigorenko's first arrest and committal had its roots nearly 10 years earlier when he was still a respected Major General. The Frunze Military Academy, Moscow, Russia's leading army training college. Grigorenko arrived here after distinguished service in the Second World War, which earned him some of Russia's highest honors. For 17 years he was a professor at the academy, the head of 2 departments. But in the late 50s he grew increasingly uneasy about Khrushchev's government, and his 10 years of public protest began on September the 7th, 1961, at a party conference in Moscow.
Comrades, the question arises, is everything being done to ensure that the cult of personality is not repeated? A new personality may be emerging. I consider that the activities of Khrushchev and his associates are unwise and nationally harmful. Worst of all are the outrageously high incomes and privileges of the ruling class.
Grigorenko was hastily transferred to the Far East, but even in exile he continued to offend the authorities. In 1963 he formed a group called the Action Group for the Revival of Leninism, and by February 1964 his outspokenness had again got him into trouble. He was arrested and sent for the first time to the Serbsky Institute in Moscow. He was psychiatrically examined and declared insane.
I was taken to the most terrible prison in the Soviet Union, the so-called Special Psychiatric Hospital in Leningrad. The Soviet secret police, the KGB, parked me here as a way out of the blind alley they'd got into. They were stuck because they'd absolutely no grounds for my arrest and no way of getting a sincere confession out of me.
I remember the meetings in this hospital. A group of patients is being brought to relatives under escort. And there is my husband. We sit side by side, and it seems that for 1 hour at least it will be possible to dismiss the nightmare which surrounds us.
He murdered 3 people. When he gets violent, his strength is astonishing. This is a terrible place for a sane man. My cellmate slaughtered his 6-year-old daughter. The worst thing is that these people are mixed up with others who are as sane as I am, and it's not an accident. While I was being examined, 3 healthy people were sent to asylums, and the one definitely abnormal man was sent to a work camp.
In Leningrad, I met people who had landed in the psychiatric hospital without being mentally ill. I was especially saddened by the tragic case of Pyotr Alexeyevich Lysak. Because he'd spoken at a student meeting against the expulsion of several students for political reasons, he'd finished up in a psychiatric hospital. At the time of my arrival, he'd already been there for 7 years. He was filled with bitter anger at this wild injustice and at his ruined life. And he used to write complaints daily. Naturally, they never reached their destination. Instead, they found their way into his hospital file and were used as an excuse for further treatment. I tried to show him how pointless it was to go on this way and to shock him out of it.
The way you carry on is so unrealistic, I'm even beginning to doubt that you're normal myself.
He stopped writing abruptly, looked at me with an expression I shall remember as long as I live, and asked in a barely audible voice,
"You really think a man can spend 7 years in here and still remain normal?"
This is the inhuman system of compulsory treatment. For a healthy man who finds himself shut up here, there is one supreme horror. He himself begins to realize that in time, he will become like those who surround him. My military training and maybe the iron constitution my parents passed on to me helped me to learn quickly to insulate myself from my surroundings. And my internment in hospital passed without doing any particular harm to me. But the one thing I cannot forget, the thing that sometimes still wakes me up at night, is the memory of a wild nocturnal cry, confused with the hollow sound of shattered glass. From that I could not insulate myself.
And now?
The situation is different now. In the first place, the psychiatric examination doesn't come as a surprise. In the second place, since my first visit here, I've got to know some very conscientious psychiatrists. And I bear in mind that even when you're dealing with a criminal institution, you shouldn't forget that human beings work there. And among them, there may be some very decent people. For that reason, I'm completely at my ease now. And I see around me not doctors, but people. And I hope the experts will try to find the human side of me.
Yes, but everything you say relates to what happened at the examination here in 1964. Even if we discount the doctor's opinions. There were other things you did around that time which forced people to doubt your sanity.
I'm not aware that I did anything like that.
Here, in the records of the commission which was deciding whether to release you from the Leningrad hospital in 1965, it says that you admitted your actions are mistaken.
I also admit it now.
Well, how is it possible to reconcile all this?
Very simply. Not every mistake a man makes is the result of an unbalanced mind. I'd begun to understand my mistakes even before my arrest. You have plenty of free time in prison. So I carefully analyzed what I'd done in the past. And when I'd reread the whole of Lenin, I saw how many crude mistakes I'd made. They were the results of my faulty political development and my oversimplified Bolshevik-Leninist education. I'd got used to thinking that only what Lenin said was right. So when I stumbled across a discrepancy between what Lenin had written and what happened in real life, I saw only one way out. Back to Lenin. But that was a mistake. Basic changes have taken place in our country, and no one can turn back the clock. even to 1952. Still less to 1924. I didn't understand that in the early 60s. It was my greatest mistake.
Then how do you explain that for a year or more after the psychiatric treatment, you behaved properly and normally? But then you went back to your old ways.
On April 29th, 1965, after 14 months in the Leningrad psychiatric prison, Grigorenko was released, but he was a marked man.
By Khrushchev's order of August the 29th, 1964, my husband had been demoted to the rank of private and expelled from the party as mentally unbalanced. In December 1965, 8 months after his release, he was certified to be mentally healthy and his case removed from the files. But this was not followed by the restoration of his party card, of his military rank, or of the pension he had earned by 34 years of honorable military service. He was forced to go to work as a loader.
I didn't write anything for distribution in 1965 and 1966. I had no time. I worked loading and unloading goods to earn a living for me and my family. It was very hard work. 12 hours a day with no day off, so I felt exhausted. When I came home, I had only enough strength to crawl into bed. I lost weight till my clothes hung off me.
The second reason I didn't write anything was that during those 18 months, I still had hopes of getting my pension back. It had been stopped illegally, and I was entitled to it. If I had got my full pension back, you and I wouldn't be talking here now, because while I was in Leningrad hospital, I'd already thought about writing a history of the great patriotic war when I was released, and I was longing to get on with that. But my own experience showed me that cases of repression were increasing all the time, rather than becoming fewer. I was barred from any kind of job and forced to live in semi-starvation. I was constantly humiliated by an illegal watch, night and day. And all of that showed me clearly that the time hadn't yet come when I could climb into an ivory tower and indulge in pure scholarship. Until there's a real defense against the abuse of power in our country, it's the duty of every honest person to help to create that defense, no matter what the risk to him. So I joined the ranks of those who fight against the abuse of power.
March 1966. Grigorenko's new fight was soon in trouble with the KGB. 1 month earlier, the writers Sinyavsky and Daniel had been tried and sentenced on a charge of publishing anti-Soviet works in the West. Grigorenko was active in protesting about the trial and joined a committee which planned to demonstrate in Red Square on the anniversary of Stalin's death. The committee were promptly rounded up and interrogated by General Svietlichny of the KGB.
Even if you go out onto the streets with placards, reading "Long live the Leninist Central Committee," we shall still put you in lunatic asylums.
The Constitution of the USSR, Article 125. In conformity with the interests of the working people, and in order to strengthen the socialist system, the citizens of the USSR are guaranteed by law freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, including the holding of mass meetings, freedom of street processions and demonstrations.
Addition to the Criminal Code of the Republic, effective September 16, 1966. Article 190, Section 1. Spreading deliberately false statements against the Soviet Union, either in print or by word of mouth, punishable by 3 years' detention.
Thanks for letting me know, anyway. Be careful. Goodbye.
For Grigorenko, the new law was intolerable. He was convinced that it suppressed basic liberties guaranteed by the Constitution, and he said so. He was equally convinced that he had an obligation to continue his fight to defend the Constitution by any means available. The means he chose were direct and dangerous. He set out to expose publicly what he saw as anti-constitutional acts committed by the government, and he went right to the top.
Open letter to the Moscow electors in the constituency of A.N. Kosygin. Comrades, A.N. Kosygin, as a member of Stalin's government and a first deputy premier in Khrushchev's government, bears full responsibility for the activities of both these governments, including their mistakes. Even in a matter which especially compromised former administrations, the observation of socialist legality, he sticks to what he learnt from Stalin and Khrushchev. He thinks that Soviet law does not apply to him. A person capable of such things does not deserve the trust of the voters. And therefore I shall vote against him, and I call on all voters to follow my example, and thus demonstrate that there is no room in the supreme government of our country for those who abuse their power.
But you're wrong when you say I went back to my old ways. What I've done these last 2 years isn't even superficially like what I was doing before.
Where's the difference? Only your tactics are different. In substance, it comes down to the same thing?
No, there's also a difference in substance. Before 1964, I acted in a typical Bolshevik way, aiming to set up a strictly underground illegal organization and to distribute illegal leaflets. Today, there's no organization and no leaflets. Instead, there are open and fearless protests against obvious illegal actions, against lies and hypocrisy, and against the distortion of truth.
Before 1964, it was a call to overthrow the regime of that time
And to turn back to what Lenin taught. Today, it's a call to destroy the obvious evils within our society, a struggle for the strict observance of the existing laws, for the implementation of the constitutional rights of our people. That time it was a call for revolution. Today it's an open struggle within the framework of the law for democracy in our social life. So what do these tactics really have in common? If you consider the only normal Soviet citizen is the one who meekly bends his head when he comes up against the bureaucrats abusing their power, then of course I am not normal. I am not capable of that sort of obedience, no matter how much I am beaten.
I've shed blood for my country and I won't be interfered with by children. You think you're frightening me, but you're not.
January 8th, 1968. A brush with a police photographer outside the courtroom where another trial was in progress. Once again, Grigorenko was refused entry, protested, and helped with a petition. Again, he was questioned by the KGB. But the Soviet authorities were now beginning to worry about a challenge from another direction. July 1968. Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček flirts with freedom. Grigorenko delivered a letter backing the Czech liberal cause to the Czech embassy in Moscow. The letter also hinted that Soviet patience might be running out.
Observing the activities of the new leadership of the Czech Communist Party, we feel more and more admiration for its courageous, wise, and uncompromising struggle to re-establish the party's prestige. But fear is being expressed that, assuming the development of events appear to be unfavorable from their point of view, the ruling circles of our country are planning to use the armed forces to halt such a development. We Soviet communists consider such fears unfounded.
A few weeks later, Grigorenko's carefully phrased optimism was dashed, and Russian troops entered Czechoslovakia. In Moscow, Pavel Litvinov and Larisa Daniel organized a peaceful protest against the invasion. Grigorenko led demonstrations at their trial. Outside the court, he again clashed with a KGB agent who tried to grab the petition. Grigorenko marched the agent off to the police station to insist that he should be charged with hooliganism. Now his protests began to gather a desperate momentum. He spoke out on elections.
The editors of Izvestia and Pravda. We do not have elections. We have voting for the one and only candidate presented by those who today hold power. So the elections are a hollow comedy. I do not want to take part in any comedies. So I shall go to vote only when my vote starts to mean something.
On the rights of minorities like the exiled Crimean Tatars.
You don't beg to be allowed to enjoy the rights which belong to you. You demand. Begin to demand. And demand not bits, not parts, but demand all that was unlawfully taken from you. Don't limit your activities to the writing of petitions. Strengthen your demands by all the means available to you under the Constitution. Make good use of freedom of speech in the press, of meetings, street processions, and demonstrations.
On Czechoslovakia and the suicide of student Jan Palach.
To the citizens of the Soviet Union, we all bear some part of the guilt for Jan Palach's death. Citizens of our great country, the greatness of a country lies not in its armed forces, but in the moral strength of its people. Shall we then continue to look on in silence while our Czechoslovak brothers perish? We call on all the Soviet people to use every legal means to bring about the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Czechoslovakia.
And at the funeral of a fellow dissenter, the writer Alexei Kostyerin, Grigorenko attacked the official bureaucratic machine.
On taking leave of a dead friend, it is usual to say, "Rest in peace, dear friend." I shall not say it. Don't sleep, Alexei. Carry on the fight. According to Kostyerin, man is a thinking being. Therefore, it is natural for man to judge reality critically and to draw his own conclusions and freely voice his convictions and opinions. For this, he was greatly hated by those who think that people exist only to provide a background for leaders, to applaud them and blindly believe them, to tolerate humiliations without a murmur, and grunt with pleasure when their trough is fuller than the next man's, and their gruel thicker. Kostyerin never tired of repeating Lenin's words, "There is nothing more cruel or more soulless than the machine of a bureaucratic establishment." And he considered that a communist had no greater task than to destroy that machine. This is what the machine is like. It is a machine kept going by our hands and minds which mercilessly crushes us, destroying the best people in our society, which exonerates people from all blame and responsibility for the crimes committed by the machine, and frees its servants from their consciences. Terrifying, cruel, soulless machine.
Confiscate. Confiscate.
7 a.m., November 19th, 1968. Grigorenko's Moscow flat was raided by the KGB.
Confiscate.
In a 12-hour search, every manuscript, note and scrap of paper with his handwriting was taken away.
Confiscate.
Grigorenko wrote his most detailed protest and analysis and sent it to Attorney General Rudienko.
Confiscate.
Already for more than 3 years, I have been the subject of continuous surveillance.
Confiscate.
Constant round-the-clock trailing of myself, the members of my family and my visitors. Permanent observation of my flat by visual and other special means. The tapping of my telephone, the reading of my correspondence, and the non-delivery of some letters. Twice in this time, my flat has been secretly searched. I am a communist, and as such I detest with all my soul those who exploit illegal force and arbitrary power because of their privileged position. In our country, the exploiters include the organization created by Stalin, and now called the KGB. I do not hide from anyone my hatred of that organization.
Confiscate.
I protest at the confiscation of that manuscript. It deals with the outbreak of the last war. What possible use can it...
Confiscate.
Listen to this. Stalin is dead, but the poisonous seeds sown by him continue to germinate.
This is ridiculous. I refuse to stay here any longer while this totally illegal and arbitrary search goes on.
Confiscate. Confiscate.
Why is all this being done? Maybe they hope to find something that could be used to build a case so as to get me out of the way somewhere where my voice will not be heard. This is quite possible, but stupid. To stage a trial based on false material is too risky these days. And the KGB know they cannot count on my committing some real offense. I, too, have never counted on the stupidity of the enemy.
Wednesday, May the 7th, 1969. Retired Soviet General Grigorenko, a leading Moscow critic of the Soviet government, was reported to have been arrested tonight. According to police, he has been detained on a charge of slandering the regime while attending the trial of 10 Crimean Tatars in Tashkent.
June 15. The third day of my hunger strike against my illegal detention in the cellars of the Tashkent KGB. They began to feed me by force. First, I wondered why this was being started so soon. And then I realized that they decided to break me at once. As they were forcing me into the straitjacket, I was beaten and throttled. Then began the agonizing process of putting the distender into my throat. June 16 to June 19. Forced feeding daily. I resisted as best I could. I was again beaten and throttled. My arms were twisted. I was purposely beaten on my wounded leg. After each feeding, I wrote a statement describing the ill treatment to which I'd been subjected. June 19. I struggled for a long time, usually ending by collapsing with terrible pains in the heart. But I went on struggling even harder, hoping that my heart would give out. In my desperation, I'd come to the point of wanting to die, because I thought my death would expose their abuses of power. June 20. Supervising Magistrate Naumova came into my cell and gave me to understand that, in fact, they were hoping for my death and expecting it. The thought swept through me. Why should I help them? Why should I meet them halfway? When she left, something I'd been told by the head of the isolation section before I started my hunger strike struck me with a new force.
Don't think that the way you're resisting will earn you a martyr's funeral. We won't give your body to your relatives. They won't even be able to find out the date of your death. Maybe they'll be informed 3 days later, or maybe 3 months, or maybe in 6 months' time. And they'll never know where you're buried.
Grigorenko was held in the KGB cellars in Tashkent for a total of 5 months without trial. During this time, he was not allowed a single visitor. He was interrogated 8 times and psychiatrically examined. After a rigorous 3-hour session with a distinguished panel of doctors, he was declared sane. Then, on October the 21st, 1969, he was suddenly transferred to Moscow.
My mood was good. Whatever was going to happen to me, the fact that I was being transferred to Moscow ended my illegal detention in Tashkent. A happy thought occurred to me. Could it be that the case is closed? This didn't last long. Though I could only see a small section of the road from the van, I soon realized where we were going, for for I know Moscow well. When Mayakovsky Revolution and Smolensk squares whizzed by, I had no doubt. Serbsky. 28 days of so-called clinical investigation. At the Serbsky, the psychological test is also considered to be a serious part of the investigation. But the professor who carried out the test obviously understood how foolish and irrelevant our conversation was. He looked confused and embarrassed.
Please make successive subtractions of 17 from 200 and read out the results.
200, 183, 166, 149, 132.
How do you feel?
115, 98, 81.
How do you feel?
As usual. 64, 47.
How do you feel?
30.
You will appear before the Commission on November 19.
Which are your present mistakes?
I don't think that's a proper subject for our conversation today. To make a thorough analysis of my mistakes in recent years, I would have to discuss them with somebody who shared my views. I don't think we share the same views. To talk about my beliefs as a sort of repentance is something I can't do. Even if I did regret something, I wouldn't repent when I'm under the executioner's axe. It's unworthy of a man to repent under the threat of punishment or death.
Well, thank you, Pyotr Grigorovich. I understand. Have you any questions?
Throughout the entire conversation, this man had turned his face away and covered it with his left hand. For some reason, he had aroused my interest. So when he said he had several questions, I was glad because I thought I was going to see his face at last. Far from it.
How do you see your future?
It's difficult for me to answer that question. No matter how hard I try, I can't see beyond the trial.
Are you still determined to appear before the court?
Unfortunately, that decision doesn't rest with me. Naturally, I would prefer the case to end with a preliminary investigation. As I said, that doesn't depend on me.
But you would not have to go on trial if you had treatment.
I have nothing that needs treatment, and I won't pretend to be ill so as to evade responsibility. I'm prepared to answer fully for all I've done.
If you're sentenced, you lose your pension.
There's a good Russian proverb. A man who has lost his head doesn't cry on account of his hair. Whether I'm convicted as a criminal or shut away in a prison called a hospital of forensic psychiatry, the most vital thing I lose is my freedom. That can't be replaced by a pension. So why should I bother about my pension? And why do you assume that I will be convicted? I don't consider myself guilty, and I will try to prove it in court.
Do you really plan to defend yourself, regardless of everything?
I don't quite understand what you mean by regardless of everything. I don't intend to lie or evade responsibility. I will speak sincerely and honestly about what I've done and why I've done it. Anyway, I'll speak the truth as I see it. But even if I fail to prove my innocence, the maximum sentence I can receive under the article they'll try to charge me with is 3 years. That means by the time the sentence comes into effect, I shall have about 2 years left to serve. The so-called treatment wouldn't be any shorter. And those 2 years won't be spent in a closed prison. Instead, I'll be in a labor camp, working in the fresh air among normal people. And then I could be given less than 3 years, or even just exiled, in which case I won't lose my pension. And the last possibility is that there might be an amnesty for the centenary of Lenin's birth. If I'm sentenced, the amnesty could apply to me. Under the treatment, there's no hope of that. A madman gets no amnesty from his madness.
Thank you, Pyotr Grigorovich. I think that'll be all.
So ended my second psychiatric session this year with a commission of experts. The results are still unknown to me. When I do know, I will be able to decide for certain whether it is only the bricks and mortar of the Serbsky Institute which remain as criminal relics from the miserable past, or whether the people who work there are also dangerous criminals, hiding themselves under white coats.
The investigation committee did its work. 3 months later, on February the 27th, 1970, the trial took place without the presence of the defendant. My husband was deprived of the right to defend himself. And from now on, as he is officially mentally disabled, he is totally deprived of any human rights.
More news about Grigorenko has now reached the West. Early this summer, he was transferred to the prison mental hospital at Cherniachovsk, near the Polish border. This used to be a German forced labor prison and is now one of the severest detention centers in Russia. He still refuses to renounce his views. For a time, he shared a cell with a murderer. Now he's in solitary confinement and denied any access to a lavatory. Grigorenko is a sick man, and his relatives fear for his life. In August, a number of his friends proposed a modest campaign on his behalf. Their slogan is, "A pen for Pyotr Grigorovich Grigorenko." He has now refused any writing materials. Presumably, there must be no more prison diaries.